Yeah. It's new, so I haven't done a lot. And I'm just gonna take it off.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah. But you know, when you look at it, there's enough.
Okay, great. Wait. We are waiting now for the other online participants to rejoin, and we'll resume at that time.
In the meantime, Commissioner Fielder, could we do a brief audio check? Can you hear us? I'll try that one more time here. Commissioner Fielder, can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine. Apparently you couldn't hear me until I put my headset back on.
All right, there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Council, if you have any folks on behalf of your client that were participating remotely, it doesn't look like they have rejoined us here. Would you like us to wait until those potential witnesses rejoin, or may we proceed? All right. Okay.
We are back on the record. People are joining us, rejoining us. We're out of the closed session. Mr. Hensley, do you want to continue, or are you done with your cross-examination?
I have more questions. Thank you.
Please.
Mr. Gorman, you also presented an alternative 50 megawatt aeroderivative option at the Dave Gates generating station with the dual fuel capability, right?
I did.
Where did you find that dual fuel option?
It was another resource identified in the IRP plan from Northwestern.
And you chose a liquefied natural gas option, right?
I did. Yes,
Was there also a diesel fuel option?
there was. Yes,
The diesel fuel option was cheaper, right?
it was. Yes,
And that's true with respect to capital costs and fixed O&M.
Yes,
The existing DGS facility has dual fuel capability with diesel, right?
it does. Yes.
So you deliberately chose a liquefied natural gas option despite its inconsistency with DGS existing facility.
Well, I did because in data response, they said that there was environmental permit limitations on the operation of the Davy Gates facilities on diesel. For that reason, I used an alternative fuel source other than diesel.
You know what that limit was?
I believe it was in a data response. I don't have it memorized.
Would it surprise you if it was like 700 hours?
I think it was 400 hours, but it could be like that. But I don't know whether, I asked Northwestern what it would take to include dual fuel capability on a new aero unit at Dave Gates, and they wouldn't provide a response to that question.
Okay. So you also chose that option despite the fact that it was more expensive than the diesel fuel option, right?
For the reason I just outlined, is Northwestern wasn't clear on a data response, and I knew there was environmental limitations on how much diesel fuel could be burned at that site. So I used a non-diesel backup fuel source.
So you chose the more expensive proxy, right?
Of the two proxies in the resource plan that had backup fuel options for an aero unit, I chose the one for liquid natural gas, which was more expensive than the facility for backup based on diesel fuel. Yes.
So Northwestern's customers will have to pay more for a liquefied natural gas proxy than it would on the other proxy, right?
It would pay more for backup diesel fuel. It'd pay more for no backup fuel at all, which is the proxy Northwestern chose. But for the reasons I just went through, it was chosen because I didn't know whether or not environmental limitations on the use of diesel fuel at the Dave Gates site existed.
Are you aware the commission requires least cost planning principles for avoided costs?
I'm aware of that, and we encourage them to do that.
Which was the least cost between the dual fuel option with diesel and the one with liquefied natural gas?
Well, if it would not have been environmentally permissible to include another diesel backup fueled aero generator at Dave Gates, then the only option would have been a liquefied natural gas backup fuel option. So the only option with potential limitations based on environmental rules and regulations was the LNG. Again, I explored that issue with Northwestern on what a backup fuel source would be, and they wouldn't respond to the answer.
I believe the record will show they did respond to the answer, and it was 700 hours. And if it was 700 hours, that would mean we could operate on diesel for 30 days straight, right?
I believe the response you're referring to talks about the backup fuel for the existing Dave Gates sites. In that same response, we asked for backup fuel on the additional 50 megawatt aero unit. And there was no response to those specific questions on that new unit at Dave Gates.
We can review our data responses, but you're aware that that Dave Gates Generating Station was planned for and permitted for a 200 megawatt build out, right?
I'd have to review the permits, but I believe that's correct.
Okay, and it currently only is 150 megawatts, right?
That's correct.
So if we added a 50 megawatt proxy, we would still be within the 200 megawatt limit that was already permitted, right?
Well, the math is right. Whether or not the permits allow for another 50 megawatt unit backup fuel, where the backup fuel source was diesel, is not clear. And again, I asked the company specifically to provide information on that, and it wasn't provided.
Well, the company represented that
I'm actually on standby for.
the company actually represented that it was permitted and designed for a 200 megawatt build out. And so are you telling me if our permits are in place for a 200 megawatt facility, would the diesel alternative be more appropriate from your perspective?
It's a lower cost option for the Dave Gates. It'd certainly be better than the company's proposed proxy unit.
And it would be cheaper than yours, right?
It'd be more expensive than yours and cheaper than mine. That's right.
Okay. And then which is the least cost option between the Arrow Northwestern chose, the Arrow you chose with liquefied natural gas, or the Arrow with the diesel option?
Which would be lower cost
Yeah, the least cost.
for backup fuel source. If environmental permits, it would be with the diesel backup.
That's not the question I asked you. The question I asked you was which one of those was the least cost option identified in the plan? The Arrow that Northwestern chose, the Arrow that you chose with the liquefied natural gas, or the Arrow that with the diesel?
Well, for firm, it wasn't clear in the company's resource plan whether or not another 50 megawatt unit without backup fuel is the least cost option. It was the lowest installed cost and the lowest operating expense, but their resource plan did not support it as a resource that was needed for serving peak demands on the system.
Again, I'm just asking you straight costs. I think you said it in there, but I want to confirm. The Arrow Northwestern chose was the least cost option that was identified in the plan.
Well,
I'm not saying
need
identified
to
with
be-
the dual fuel. I'm just saying identified in the plan.
Well, we need to be clear on least cost, because least cost implies that it is the best and lowest cost resource selection needed to meet the capacity needs of the utility. And from that standpoint, Northwestern selection of the 50 megawatt Arrow unit without backup fuel was not identified as the least cost resource in their plan. What it was identified is the lowest capital cost and lower operating cost of the 3 Arrow units in the capital plan.
Thank you. And you recalculated Mr. Bobineau's revenue requirement for the 50 megawatt, that Arrow that Northwestern chose, right?
Yes.
And in your calculation, you escalated fixed O&M costs throughout the course of the contract and then levelized them, right?
I did. Yes.
Okay. And you did the same for your 50 megawatt Arrow with the liquefied natural gas proxy, right?
Yes.
And that escalation, that reflects increased costs in future years throughout the contract, right?
Yeah. It's a fixed cost of operating the plant over the contract term. That's correct.
Yeah. And those costs, they won't be incurred until in the future, right?
Well, they will be incurred over the term of the contract, which went into assigning a fixed price for that contract as avoiding incurring those costs over that contract term.
Right. But if KELP's contract terminates prior to the end of the 18.5-year term that you propose, then customers would be overpaying for that escalation you included for whatever years after the termination date, right?
Not within I addressed that issue in my testimony because of the levelized nature. What customers would pay based on early termination would be lower than what they would have otherwise paid using a declining balance methodology for establishing the avoided capacity price of that unit.
If the escalation increase you included were actually reflective of costs that would be incurred in years that after KELP had terminated, but KELP, when you levelize, KELP would be receiving the benefit for those costs in those later years, right?
That's not the only added item included in my avoided capacity price, but that specific item would be overstated with early contract termination. However, the larger portion in the price, which is the capital costs of the unit, would result in customers paying less under my avoided capacity price with a levelized cost methodology as opposed to a declining balance cost methodology.
Yeah, we'll get there, but I just wanted to confirm. I'm pretty sure I heard it in your answers. When we're talking about just that escalation piece, it would be overstated if KELP's contract terminated early.
Just the O&M piece of the total price, which is a relatively small piece of the avoided cost price.
But it would still be an increase to customers' rates, right?
It would be a representation of the avoided cost, which would be based on a contract term and some of the escalation anticipated. And arriving at that portion of the avoided cost price may not turn out to be consistent with actual O&M cost.
Northwestern disputes those costs. We'll just leave it at that. But regardless,
Council testifying.
I'm just leading the witness where I'm going. Let's talk about how you calculated those escalated costs. You originally calculated $1.93 for fixed O&M escalation for both of those proxies, Northwestern's and the proxy with the liquefied natural gas, right? I believe
Yeah, consistent with what the expected fixed O&M cost would be for those units in the IRP study. That's correct. In the IRP, Northwestern's IRP study.
only after Northwestern demanded that you support that figure, you corrected it to $1.61 for Northwestern's proxy and $1.67 for your proxy, right?
I think there was an inflation adjustment, correction made to my original analysis because the historical inflation was not measured correctly.
Okay, so you incorrectly calculated the escalation the first time. And if that would not have been corrected, it would have been detrimental to Northwestern's customers, right?
We've overstated the price. Yeah.
Yeah, I know overstating prices is detrimental to customers, right?
Well, it is, but that's not the only component of the price, and the combination of the full price would not have produced would not have detrimentally impacted customers because the cost for capacity in the early years would have been lower than what Northwestern would be charging customers had they invested in the new Dave Gates facility included in traditional cost of service.
Again, we'll get there. You also originally escalated the DGS costs from 2018 to 2021 by 4.7% in your rebuttal, right?
Yes.
Only after Northwestern demanded that you support that figure, you corrected it to 3.5, right?
And demand it. They asked for the backup work papers, and when we collected them, we realized there was an error in the calculation.
Another error.
Another error.
Well, I believe you said you missed it. You erred on the escalation and you erred on the escalation after the period of the contract begins. You erred on the escalation from 2018 to 2021, and you erred on the 2.8% in energy rates. So another error, right?
Well, there's one error on inflation, and the 2.8% was a correction I also made in rebuttal. That's correct. The adjustment to the energy rate.
Well, what do you mean there's only one error on escalation? Then we just established that you originally calculated $1.93 for the fixed O&M escalation.
Yeah, based on the company's resource plan.
And then you made another error on the escalation from 2018 costs to 2021 costs, right?
And it was part of the same calculation, but yeah, that there was a correction to that inflation adjustment.
Okay, so another error. And if Northwestern wouldn't have requested you to support that 4.7% and you wouldn't have corrected it to 3.5, that would have been detrimental to customers, right?
Correcting it reduced my proposed avoided cost capacity price. That's correct.
Right. And reducing the cost is beneficial to customers.
Yes.
Okay. Northwestern estimated a DGS proxy would operate for 30 years, right?
Didn't dispute that, but that's correct. Yes. I did not dispute that, but that is correct.
If Northwestern pursued a 50 megawatt proxy at DGGS instead of KELP, Northwestern would expect customers to receive the benefits of that proxy for the full 30 years, right?
If they made an investment with an expected 30-year operating life, they would expect to get 30 years worth of service out of the investment. Yes.
And the cost in Mr. Bobno's revenue requirement for Northwestern's DGS proxy are less in the last 11 and a half years compared to the first 18 and a half years, right?
Well, the declining balance revenue requirement is lower at the end than it is at the beginning. That's correct.
Okay. So if Northwestern pursued the DGS proxy instead of KELP, its customers would receive the benefits of those reduced costs in the proxy's revenue requirement in the later years, right?
Well, possibly. There could be retrofits to the unit over that 30-year period, which were not reflected in either his or my analysis. And the reality is most generating units do have major capital improvements over a 30-year operating life. So we set aside that reality of capital improvements in those costs and measuring this avoided cost capacity payment. But simply looking at the original investment cost of the unit, that is true. But it's not true to suggest that customers would pay more at the end of the life because there are other factors that would impact customers' rates, which were considered neither by the company or by me.
Right. And I'm only talking about your analysis and Mr. Bobineau's analysis. But for those 30 years, if everything stayed stagnant, using those analyses, customers would benefit because the costs are reduced in the last 11 and a half years of the revenue requirement.
With the qualifications I just went through, that's the revenue stream that he and I both used. Yes.
Right. Okay. And your recalculation of Mr. Bobineau's revenue requirement does not reflect any of those reduced costs in the last 11 and a half years, right?
The last 11 and a half years are beyond the term of the contract. So I did not reflect them in measuring the avoided capacity cost to customers and to Northwestern over the proposed contract term.
Had your calculation included those reduced costs, your proposed rates would have been lower, right?
They would have been lower and would have been under Northwestern's avoided capacity cost during the contract extension term.
If Northwestern pursued a 50 megawatt proxy at DGS instead of Kelp, though, we'd have that resource for 30 years, right? Whereas with Kelp, we'd only have for 18 and a half.
Well, you would avoid it for 18 years, and then you could have made the Arrow unit investment at the end of the 18-year contract extension, which point then customers would receive the full benefit if that continues to be the best resource selection of the 30-year operating life of that resource.
And on a rebuttal, you also changed your proposed calculation for the Yellowstone County Generating Station, right?
I did, yes.
You increased it to 2793. Is that right?
I did, based on updated information from the company on what the accredited capacity of that unit is, and also by extending the revenue requirement term from 15 years up to 18 and a half years.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about all that stuff. So this increase occurred at the same time, your revenue requirement did decrease because you adjusted to 18 and a half years instead of your original 15, right?
It was adjusted to the 18 and a half year term, yes.
Okay. And the reason it decreased when you used 18 and a half instead of 15 is because the costs declined over the 30-year period.
It's a relatively minor impact from 15 and 18 and a half years, but that is true.
Okay. And Northwestern expects the Yellowstone County Generating Station to operate for a full 30 years too, right?
My understanding, yes.
And so customers will receive the benefits of the Yellowstone County Generating Station for the full 30 years.
They will.
Yeah. And so they will receive the benefits of those reduced costs in the last 11 and a half years of the revenue requirement, right?
Well, customers will pay for that reduced cost by paying down the original plant value over the first 18 years. And then we'll continue to pay a return on the unrecovered plant investment cost.
Right. So they'll benefit from those reduced costs in the last 11 and a half years, just like we talked about with DDGS.
The revenue requirement will be lower from year 19 through 30 than it was through 1 through 18.
Okay. And your revenue requirement doesn't reflect any of those reduced costs in the last 11 and a half years, right?
Because the contract term is 18 years, not 30. And what my proposed revenue requirement does is measure the cost you would charge customers for the capacity from Yellowstone over that 18-year contract term.
Had you levelized over the full 30 years, rates would have been less, right?
The avoided cost capacity rate would have been less, and it would have understated your avoided cost capacity for the Yellowstone during the contract term.
Your revenue requirement also decreased from your original revenue requirement because of the way you calculated income taxes, right?
We did have a disagreement in the calculation of income tax. It was a de minimis impact, but we revised our calculations to conform to the way the company has implied that they prefer to calculate income taxes. When I did that, there was a very small reduction in the revenue requirement for the unit.
Your original revenue requirement was over $200,000 higher due to the way you calculated taxes, right?
It's less than one half of 1%, but that's true. Yes.
And you changed that on rebuttal because Mr. McCarthy pointed that out. They use a different methodology than Northwestern uses, right?
Is an immaterial issue, and we decided to make the issue go away, and we accepted his methodology.
So Mr. McCarthy helped save customers from the increased revenue requirement in your original proposal, right?
Constructive conversations between Northwestern and KELP helped resolve that issue. Yes,
And that the resolution of that issue helped customers.
it resulted in de minimis downward adjustment in the implied avoided cost capacity price.
Is your revenue requirement for the Yellowstone County Generating Station a net present value revenue requirement?
Yes,
So it accounts for the fact that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow.
well, it levelizes the annual revenue requirements of the facility over the contract term, and restates those revenue requirements. So the company collects the same revenue requirement in the levelized methodology as it would have under the traditional declining balance methodology. So it makes the company whole for recovering cost of service, which makes customers whole for paying no more under the proposed avoided cost capacity price relative to what they would have paid under traditional rate making, but does it in a levelized manner, which reduces cost to customers up front, and may benefit them if the contract term is something shorter than 18 years.
You average the costs of service for O&M expenses, fixed gas transmission, reservation, property taxes, and commission and MCC taxes over the 18.5 period. Commission and MCC taxes over the 18.5 year period. Is that right?
I did, yeah, because customers would pay those based on escalated cost to the company.
So using an average, those costs are the same in each year of the calculation, except last year because it's a half a year, right?
It's a projection of the escalation in those costs over the contract term, yes.
So averaging those costs doesn't incorporate any of the time value of money discounting then, right?
But it does accurately measure of the difference between a declining balance revenue requirement and a levelized revenue requirement.
But in your revenue requirement, they're the same for each year moving forward.
Yeah, there's no capital costs associated with those items for Northwestern. They are expenses the company pays. So we escalated those. And in measuring a levelized revenue requirement, which will charge customers the same on a levelized basis as they would on a declining balance basis, we reflected the escalation in those cost of service items.
Yeah, but if you would have applied a discount based on the time value of money, those shouldn't have been the same every single year of the contract, right?
There is no carrying charge applied to those expense items. So a discounting implies that you can pay one price today versus paying annual charges plus accrued carrying charges over the term of the contract. That applies to the capital cost items where a discounting factor was included. But for the fixed O&M costs where there's no carrying charge, there was no discount of those expenses to arrive at a levelized revenue requirement that meets the objective of measuring what cost customers would pay for capacity from that facility over the term of the contract.
If you had incorporated a discount for the time value of money, rates would have been less, right?
It would have been less, and they would have understated what the cost of operating that facility would have been over the 18-year contract term.
Less costs are beneficial to customers, right?
That's true, but that is inconsistent with calculating an avoided cost rate in an accurate manner.
Okay. So the main increase in your rates from the Yellowstone County Generation Station, though, arose because you used 160 megawatts for the Yellowstone County needs accredited capacity, right?
Yeah, we did a lot of discovery on what the nameplate capacity rating, the guaranteed capacity rating, and the accredited capacity rating was of Yellowstone over this hearing. And the numbers we got from the company did change, or at least our understanding of the company's numbers changed throughout this process. In the original testimony, we used 165 based on the pre-certification filing company made for the Laurel generating facility, now the Yellowstone generating facility. But based on earnings releases from the company, In Discovery, we found that the guaranteed capacity factor of this not yet operating generating unit was 165 megawatts, not the nameplate rating of 170. And the expected accredited capacity of this facility was 160 megawatts, not 165. So we made those updates to our analysis based on improved information we received from the company.
Are you saying Northwestern represented in Discovery that the Yellowstone County Generating Station was only 160 megawatts of credit capacity?
They represented the guaranteed capacity output was 165.
Yeah, a guaranteed capacity output, right?
A guaranteed capacity, yes.
Yeah, so that's what the manufacturer is willing to guarantee. That doesn't mean it's limited to 165, right?
It doesn't. It could be less. It won't be less than 165. And it's a facility that is not yet operating, has no historical operating history to verify what its actual operations will be. So the manufacturer's guarantee is the best estimate, I believe, of what to use for what the guaranteed or what the capacity rating of the unit will be. And that's separate from the actual accredited capacity value of the unit.
Okay, then why did you use 160? You just said that 165 is what should be used based on the guarantee.
Because the company has represented it due to altitude and potential outages of the unit that it has a capacity rating of 160 megawatts.
Yeah, and you heard a 160 in an investor call, not anywhere in this docket, right?
Yeah, it's in the docket now because I put the investor call material in my testimony, but that is where I heard it. Yes.
Yeah, fair point. Just in your testimony, not anywhere. None of Northwestern's representations in this docket said 160, right?
They did not, but I'm assuming that presentations and make to the investment community, which is, as I understand it, subject to security and exchange regulations, are going to be accurate.
Throughout this case, Northwestern has consistently said roughly 170 megawatts, right?
As a nameplate capacity rating, yes.
We've said nameplate capacity is 175. Throughout this case, we've said 170 megawatts for accredited capacity, or roughly 170.
Well, I mean, that is a Mr. McCarthy's wrap in ELCC methodologies, what the accredited capacity rating is. It's about 165 megawatts in the ELCC, a little less than that.
And are you aware that the person who calculated the 160 megawatts in the investor call simply miscalculated it?
Well, if there had been more constructive dialogue between the parties, we may have been able to resolve that issue. But we used the best information we had on what the accredited capacity rating of the facility is.
Did you ever ask Northwestern before you filed your rebuttal testimony?
I think if there wasn't time for a response to discovery by the time we got that investor call information.
Would you agree if that was just a miscalculation that showed 160, that 160 shouldn't be used?
160, but the correct number should be used. It should be the accredited capacity of the unit, and it should be something the company can disclose and justify in testimony, and that would be the most appropriate number.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Its actual expected accredited capacity should be used, right?
And based on Mr. McCarthy's ELCC methodologies, that would be roughly 165, a little bit less than that.
I'll let Mr. McCarthy testify to what his representations are. But again, if it's accredited,
Well, that's the number I would have relied upon had I used the company's representations.
I'm sorry, what number would you have relied upon if you used the
He
company's
used
representations?
about 164.8 megawatts as the accredited capacity value for Yellowstone in his testimony in this case.
I think again, his testimony speaks for itself. And I'm going to tell you, it says roughly 170. But if the point here is, if its actual accredited capacity is more than 160 megawatts, your proposed rates would drop, right?
If it's the correct number and
Right.
it's different than 160, my numbers would be adjusted. Yes.
And if those rates dropped, that's beneficial for customers, right?
If it's done accurately.
Okay. Let's move on to contract terms. You contest Northwestern's PPA, claiming that it's designed for unbuilt renewable projects, right?
It appears to read that way. Yes.
And one of the bases for that is because it provides for security, right? That's what you said?
Provides security that appears to be written for a new unproven project. Yes.
Security protects Northwestern's customers if Kelp defaults under the contract, right?
Well, security protects Northwestern and its customers if there's any financial loss to Northwestern under a default to the contract. In this case, a default would not result in losses to Northwestern or its customers because there is no financial investment from Northwestern in Kelp for its facility.
Well, if Kelp defaulted under the contract and couldn't provide the capacity, Northwestern would have to go out and replace that capacity, right?
It would potentially have to replace that capacity at the current market price, which would be based on what the market replacement capacity cost is. The energy default provisions of the contract would be, there'd be no mark to market provisions for that, because the energy component is based on prevailing energy prices.
I'm talking about capacity. So if Northwestern had to replace the capacity because Kelp defaulted, that could be more than what Northwestern is paying Kelp under your proposed contract, right?
There can be some value to the capacity payment in the contract. That's true.
Are you aware that Northwestern based its security on about 1 year of capacity payments to Kelp and only required it to start in 2032 when we were expected to Kelp to provide capacity?
I am aware of that, but under the terms of the contract, Northwestern doesn't pay for capacity until after it's already been delivered. So there is no collection risk for that specific year.
And whether a generator or Kelp defaults, as an existing generator, Kelp can still default under the contract, right?
Yes, and then the question is, what is the cost, if any, to Northwestern? And under the structure of the contract, there would be no cost associated with replacement energy charges.
Yeah, but there could be for capacity.
There could be.
And Northwestern based the security on the capacity that it was expecting, the capacity payments that it was expecting to pay Kelp, right?
That's true.
Okay. In section 5.1 of your proposed PPA, you also alleged that Kelp provided security to Northwestern and that security would apply post June 30th, 2024. Is that right?
It's my understanding originally when the agreement was created, there was some agreement between Northwestern and Kelp for the development of the interconnection sites and the generation interconnections. There was some financial agreement between the parties.
Chairman O'Donnell, may we approach the witness? Do you know what I just handed you?
Appears to be the original portions of the original PPA agreement that's attached to my colleague, Mr. Collins' testimony.
Can you please review paragraph 5? It's at the bottom of page 57 and the top of page 58. And for the record, this is this is a portion of exhibit BCC 1. At the top of page 58, that says there are no security payments due by Kelp's predecessor or any free fund obligations by Northwestern's predecessor during the term of the PPA, right?
Does say that, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, it does say that. Yes, I apologize.
Another basis for your allegation that Northwestern's PPA is designed for unbuilt renewable projects is because it has a lender's right to cure seller event of default provision, right?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Another basis for your allegation that Northwestern's PPA is designed for unbuilt renewable projects is because it has a lender's right to cure a seller event of default provision. Is that right?
Well, it does imply that it's a new build, and kelp is not a new build. So it does suggest that it is a PPA that was designed for a facility that was being developed.
Kelp has historically had a lender at times, right?
They don't have one now. I don't know if they've had, how often they've had one in the past.
But they could have had one after they were built and operating, right?
They could have.
And Kelp could obtain another lender in the future, right?
Don't know. There's no limitations on them doing that. That's true.
Okay. And so that provision doesn't hurt Kelp, right?
I don't know. It restricts their ability to arrange a loan if they should decide they need one.
Do you know what that provision does?
Can you show me the provision that we're talking about? Do you
Yeah,
want me
it's-
to describe what it does? I'd like to look at it.
It's
Thank you.
that'd be section 8.3. And
Mr.
that's,
Hemsley, 8.3 of what document?
so I was just confirming, Chairman O'Donnell. For the record, this is section 8.3 of Northwestern's Exhibit SIS 1.
Mr. Hemsley, before you get, being that we are within the shadow of the noon hour, do you intend to go much further than this? Should we break at this point?
I do intend to go further. At whatever point you guys feel appropriate to break is fine with me.
Why don't we do that now? It is 11:57.
Oh, I was
Go
just gonna say, would it be appropriate so it's fresh in his mind after he use that just to get through this particular part real quick here?
I was thinking that this would give him time, more adequate time to review the document and to give you a better answer.
Yeah, that's fine. Do you need more time to review?
But it's a small paragraph. I think I can.
Okay, well, let's proceed with this then. Thank you.
Thank you. That provision simply provides a lender the ability to cure a kelp default, right?
It does. This is more legal in nature, but it's my understanding that kelp was concerned about restrictive covenants that may limit their flexibility in operating their facility.
All this does is allow the lender to cure a default, one of kelp's defaults, right?
I'm explaining why there was concern. There is no outstanding loan, and there was concern about operating and financial flexibility to kelp.
Wouldn't this type of provision help Kelp if it needed a lender in the future? Wouldn't a lender want the ability to cure a default?
Well, that would be an agreement between Kelp and the lender, not Kelp and Northwestern.
Okay, and you believe there's something in that particular section that would restrain Kelp from the way it operated?
That's the reason there was concern about this paragraph. It limited or constrained operating and financial operation of Kelp.
Can you tell me how?
It just did.
How this provision where a lender can cure a default could do that? Can you give me an example?
And arranging for financing, which they have none of right now. There was concern that it could create impediments to arranging for a borrowing agreement.
Because the contract would allow the lender to cure a default.
Because Northwestern would be involved in any cure of default between Kelp and the banking facility, the lending facility.
Where do you see that in that provision?
That I'm explaining to the best of my ability the concern with this paragraph.
Okay, have you ever operated or used this type of provision in a contract before?
I don't recall
Do you,
having a contract with this specific provision.
and have you ever tried to get you ever tried to obtain a loan from a lender and been declined because there was a provision like this in the contract?
Well, in contracts which were based on developing a new project, there were some capital participant assurances in it and a willingness of the parties to resolve the issues.
And did any of those lenders say, "Hey, I'm not gonna give you this loan because it gives us a right to cure your default"?
I haven't done that research.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hensley. So it is now exactly 12 o'clock noon. We will break for lunch. We will reconvene at 1:15. And so we are now off the record.